What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. For today's video, what I wanted to do is show you guys how to replace an alternator on your Infiniti G35 Coupe, G35 sedan if it's not a 2003. Those are a little bit different. A 350Z. This video will pretty much apply to those vehicles. 2003 G35 Coupe sedans have a clutch fan, which the procedure for that is a little bit different, but it really isn't that much different, and all you got to do is kind of move the fan a little bit so that you can get this long bolt out. Aside from that, everything else is pretty much the same. Now, if you have a 370Z or G37, there is some differences, but the alternator is basically in the same location, and it kind of is held on by the same type of fastener. And you kind of have to remove the same things out of the way that you're going to be removing from this vehicle. So hopefully this video kind of helps you understand how to replace those alternators on those vehicles. It's not exactly the same, but it is very similar, so hopefully this helps. So without any further delay, let's get right into today's video. Some of the tools that you're going to need to do this repair are a long 3/8 ratchet or a 1/2 inch ratchet if you have a G37 or 370Z. You're going to need a flathead or a Phillips screwdriver depending on the style of drain plug that you have. You're going to need a pair of pliers. You're going to need a 12mm socket, a 14mm socket, and you're also going to need a 10mm gear wrench, a 12mm gear wrench, and you're also going to need a pry bar or a flathead. And you will also need a 6-inch extension so that you can remove the tension off of the tensioner. So right in front of me, I have a used alternator with about 50,000 miles. So that's what I'm going to be installing today. But I also have another alternator here to show you guys how your alternator is going to look like when it's in the vehicle. So this is your alternator, right? Now, as you guys can see, there is a bracket on this alternator and there's a wiring harness. This is going to be the most difficult part about this job, in my opinion. And that is to either remove this bracket by removing these two, either 8mm or 10mm. Sometimes these can be 10 or 8, depending if it's aftermarket or not. I believe these should be 10, but on this vehicle there were 8. So you might have an 8 or a 10mm fastener holding down this bracket. The next thing that you're going to do is remove the 12mm fastener, or nut I should say, on the back. This can be a little bit challenging if you don't have a gear wrench, so I would suggest getting a 12mm gear wrench, moving this little plastic condom out of the way, and put the wrench on here to break this guy loose, and it'll come out. Now this seems like a lot of work, and it kind of is. So if you don't want to go through the hassle of disconnecting this, wiring harness from here and this other cable right here, what you could do is, like I suggested, is remove these two fasteners. You can do that. In my opinion, this is kind of easier, but it is challenging to put these fasteners back on because the alternator is kind of heavy, so you got to mess around with that. So it just depends on what you want to do. Aside from that, you're going to have another connection here that goes to the alternator. So you're going to put your finger right behind here, pinch down and pull up, and that's going to unhook the connection right there. The other problem that you're going to run into is that there's this long bolt that won't come out because it's going to make contact with the radiator fans. So that's enough of me talking. Let me show you guys what I think is the best way at tackling an alternator replacement on these vehicles. So there is two things that you need to make sure that you do before you try to do the alternator change, and that is to first disconnect your negative terminal from your battery. If you don't do that and you try to remove that connection to the alternator, you're going to short stuff out and you're going to blow fuses. So make sure you do that first. The next thing you want to make sure is that your vehicle is cold because you are going to lose a little bit of coolant if you disconnect this hose, because you need to disconnect it to kind of move the radiator fan up so that you can remove it. So as you can see, I have the vehicle supported by jack stands. Right now what I'm going to do is drain a little bit of the coolant. You don't need to remove everything, just drain it a little bit so that you don't have to bleed the system too much. So normally the drain plug is on this side. If you have a 350Z, sometimes it'll be over here. So just look for the location of your drain plug. If you have a 370Z, the subframe is going to look a little different. but normally your drain plug is on this side on the 370Z and a G37. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Mine on this vehicle is right here, as you can see. So just unscrew that and drain a little bit of coolant. So now that you're here, if you don't have it under tray, what you can do is start disconnecting the sensors that go on the bottom of the alternator. So I'll show you those now. So right over here on this side, you guys can see that we have a sensor connection. You want to go ahead and disconnect this because there is just one little cable that runs to it. A lot of times you can break this, or you can pull the actual cable out of the connector here, and you're gonna have to fix that. And you guys can see that this guy is kind of tied down to the back of the alternator right here. So I feel like if you do it now and get it out of the way, it's less likely that you'll break it. I'm gonna just remove this little tie down from this bracket so that this cable is nice and free now. Alright, there you go. So this right here is the back of the alternator. I'm not gonna worry about disconnecting the cable that goes to the back of the alternator just yet, because it is very tight, and I feel like when you loosen up the alternator, you'll have better access at getting to the connection. So I like to leave that step kind of towards the end. What you could do here is, you could disconnect this connector that goes to the alternator by pushing it on the tab and removing it. Since you're here, what you can also do is disconnect your radiator fan connections. So there is one right here and one up here. So just go ahead and pinch down on these little tabs, and this connector will come out. You do that to both of them right here. So the last thing that we're going to do is remove the tension from the belt. In order to do that, what you have to do is break loose this 14mm nut. Don't remove it all the way. All you got to do is just break it loose, kind of just finger loose. And then once you do that, you're going to go ahead and remove tension by unscrewing this long fastener right here. This is a 12mm. So go ahead and do that now. It helps if you have an extension so that you can put it through here, the back of the sway bar, and use a ratchet. You want to go ahead and make sure that that is loose first though, because if you don't, you're going to mess up the rod and it won't screw back in. Alright, so it's loose now. Now I'll get an extension, a 12mm socket, and then I'll go ahead and remove the tension by unscrewing this guy. So as you guys can see, I have the socket right on that 12mm rod. I'm going to reverse it, and it should bring down the pulley down with the belt. Go. What you could also do at this time is remove this 12mm fastener that holds the alternator to this bracket. So you can do that now, or you can wait to the point where we remove the radiator fan. It's really up to you. I'm gonna remove it now. I'm gonna use a ratchet. You could also use a gear wrench to get in there like this and just break it loose. It's really up to your preference. Now, if I haven't mentioned it before, these fasteners can be on there pretty tight, so use a long ratchet or a breaker bar to break these guys loose. So at this point, we're pretty much done with everything on the bottom. What we need to do now is remove our intake out of the way. So all you gotta do is remove this guy and this guy. I'm gonna loosen up the clamp here so that I can remove this guy up and out of the way. Disconnect my mass airflow sensor. Disconnect this 10mm.
air box. There you go, set it off to the side. That literally took less than a minute. As you guys can see, we have a lot more clearance. This is the 10mm fastener that you need to remove on this side, along with this one over here. If you have broken tabs, then it doesn't really matter. So what we'll do now, remove this hose by unscrewing this clamp, picking up the hose this way so that no coolant drains, and then wiggle our radiator fan assembly out of the way. You can also remove this little hose right here so that it doesn't get tangled. Just set it off to the side. You don't need to remove it all the way. As you guys can see, I just have my hose kind of pinched behind the coolant tank. Nothing is leaking because we drained that little bit of coolant, and the vehicle is cold, so the coolant is not expanding. So we'll just set this off to the side here. So like I said, this is normally held on by 2 10s. Go ahead and break these guys loose. The other 10mm is going to be right here, but as you guys can see, this bracket is broken, so I don't need to really unscrew that. At this point, what you can do is just lift up the radiator fan assembly, and it should come out. So I'll show you guys here. You guys can see that the AC lines are kind of making contact. You can just bend these off to the side a little bit, or unscrew this fastener to give you more access, but you don't really need to do that. Just usually wiggling it around will make it free. There you go. We'll set this off to the side. So now that you have removed the radiator fan, you guys can see that we have a lot of working area. At this point, since we already loosened the tension on the belt, I'll go ahead and remove it and set it off to the side. Just like that. This is a good time to check your pulleys as well, just to make sure that they're good. So now there's only one bolt kind of technically holding this alternator in place, and that is the long bolt that is right here. The bolt is just kind of hidden right here behind this bolt, but it's right underneath. It's a 14mm. Use a long breaker bar or a long ratchet to break it loose. I'll use my electric ratchet just to unscrew it all the way. There you go. And as you guys can see, this guy is pretty long. If we had the radiator fans here, it would make contact. So we need to remove them out of the way, or at least slide them out of the way if you're gonna remove it from the bottom. So we'll just get this guy out. As you can see, it's pretty long. So at this point, our alternator bolts are all removed. The only thing holding this alternator on here is just little friction rings that are kind of pushing on the alternator. It might seem like it's still held on by fasteners, but I assure you there's nothing else holding it on besides that connection on the back. So get a pry bar and just kind of stick it in between the alternator and this pulley and kind of just wiggle it to the side, and you guys can see it's just moving. Alright, so as you can see, the alternator is just kind of free right there, hanging on from that connector in the back. So we'll go underneath, get our 12mm wrench, and remove that nut so that we can pull the alternator out. You can either do it this way or down, it doesn't really matter. Since I'm down there, I might even just push it down from the bottom. So this is the back of the alternator. This is why I said wait to disconnect that connection back there, because now that the alternator is pretty much free, you can easily remove the 12mm nut behind here. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. It's kind of hard to see, but trust me, it makes it a lot easier to remove this guy out of the way. Right over here we have those two 8 or 10mm fasteners that you can also remove at this time. If you couldn't disconnect those brackets, you can also use a gear wrench and have access to it. This is why I suggest waiting to removing those things at this point, because this alternator is free to move, so it can give you more room to fit your hand in here nice and easy. Whereas if you were to leave it connected and you were trying to do this while the alternator was still connected, you would have a lot less space, and you would honestly get very frustrated. So right here, what I'm gonna do is remove this bracket from the alternator. So like I said, use a 8mm or a 10mm gear wrench. This just makes it a lot easier. Since I have the tool, I'm gonna use it. But if I didn't, like I said, I would just use a gear wrench. There we go. And the alternator is pretty much free. So since I have it free, I'll remove it from here down and out of the way. So this right here is the alternator that we just removed. By looking at it, it doesn't look like there's anything wrong with it, but that's not how you test these. You gotta test the voltage. You can usually take these to like AutoZone or O'Reilly's and they'll test it for you. This again is how it looks on the back of the alternator. This is the two 10mm fasteners that I was able to remove at the end, along with this 12mm nut. Once you have this loose, you can position it in the way that you need to, so that you can have access to these fasteners. This is normally going to be covered by this little rubber protector, but all you got to do is just flip it up and put your gear wrench on here and break it loose. So I'm going to go ahead and put this alternator on. Like I said, this alternator has about 50,000 miles. I got it from an engine that has low miles. I prefer using OEM when it comes to alternators because aftermarket just kind of sucks, to be honest. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this on the vehicle. But before I put this back on the vehicle, I'm just gonna show you guys a little pro tip. Sometimes this little nut insert gets pushed out, and when you're trying to put the alternator back on, it won't fit. So what you could do is get a pair of pliers and kind of just push it off to the side again, push it in so that it's not sticking out as much. So I'll start off by trying to put my alternator back into its place. So I have one of the fasteners started. I started them by hand. I'm gonna just run them down with my electric ratchet. Once you're done doing that, connect your power to the alternator, which should be this big cable right here. So go ahead and put that back on, just like that, and then start your nut that holds it in place. So now that you have everything kind of started by hand, finish it off with your ratchet. I'm using an electric ratchet, but you can use a gear wrench like always. These don't need to be on there super tight, guys, so don't overdo it. And don't forget that 12mm right up there as well. So now that you have your connections on the back of the alternator all set, just position the alternator back in its location. This can be a little bit finicky, but it can be done. What I'll do now is finish connecting the electrical connections here on the back. So if you guys remember, this is the plug that goes to the alternator. Just push it back into its place. Make sure you hear it click. I'm also gonna connect the oil pressure sensor switch back on. So now what we gotta do is just kind of put this long bolt back in. You are gonna have to wiggle around the alternator because, as you can see, it's not going in. It helps to use the pry bar to kind of line things up and find its hole. Alright, so as you guys can see, I got the bolt back in. Like I said, this can be a little challenging just to line everything back up, but just take your time, move around the alternator, and it should eventually go back in. So I'm going to go ahead and just fasten this back down, put my belts back on, and then put my radiator cooling fans back on along with the intake, and that's pretty much it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here off camera. Once I'm done doing that, I'm also going to just top off the coolant, make sure that it's full. Whatever I took out, I'm going to put back in, and I'm going to also replace the battery as well because this damaged the battery. It's no longer good, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now.
When you're putting everything back together, just make sure that you apply the right amount of tension on the belt. If you have a G37, you don't have to worry about that. You guys have automatic tensioners. Put your cooling fans back on. Make sure you connect the fan connections. Close your drain plug and top off your coolant.
Alright, so I have a new battery installed. I got the vehicle running, and this is a good alternator right here. 14.4 volts. My multimeter doesn't work all too good, but yeah, that's kind of what you want to look for. I'm gonna do other work to this vehicle, like drain the coolant, put new coolant in it. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that off camera, but I just kind of wanted to show you guys what a normal alternator looks like. So if you guys did like the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. If you guys have other tips that might benefit other viewers, make sure to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll see you guys all in the next one. Peace out.